My stepmother made me wear a sign saying, "I'm a failure and disgrace the family," at a family barbecue. All the neighbors, dad's friends, and relatives saw it. They took photos and laughed. I was 17. When I think about the worst moments of my teenage years, this memory always comes flooding back like a punch to the gut. I'm 22 now, but that day still haunts me in ways I never expected it would. Sometimes I'll be having a perfectly normal day, and then I'll see a family having a barbecue in their backyard, and suddenly I'm right back there, standing in our backyard with that horrible cardboard sign hanging around my neck. My dad married my stepmother when I was 14. Before that, it had just been me and him for most of my life. My biological mother left when I was really young, and honestly, I barely remember her. Dad and I had this easy rhythm together. He wasn't perfect, but he was patient with me. When I struggled with math in middle school, he'd sit with me at the kitchen table for hours, working through problems until I got it. When I had friendship drama, he'd listen without judgment and give me advice that actually made sense. Then she came into our lives and everything changed overnight. She moved in with her own ideas about how a household should run, how children should behave, and what academic success looked like. My grades, which had always been average but acceptable to my dad, suddenly became a source of constant criticism and disappointment. The problems started small. She'd check my homework every night, standing over my shoulder and making comments about my handwriting, my organization, my approach to problems. She instituted a new rule where I had to show her every test and assignment the day I got it back. If I forgot to bring something home, or if I tried to delay showing her a particularly bad grade, she'd call the school and demand they email her copies of everything. By my junior year, I was struggling more than usual. I'd always been an okay student, mostly BS and CS, but that year everything felt harder. I was taking more advanced classes, trying to prepare for college applications, and the pressure was getting to me. I started getting more CS and even a few DS in my harder subjects. My dad would look at my report card with concern and ask if I needed help with anything, but my stepmother would launch into these long lectures about responsibility and how I was throwing away my future. The worst part was how she'd bring up my grades in front of other people. When relatives came over for dinner, she'd somehow work my academic struggles into the conversation. She'd make comments about how some kids just don't appreciate the opportunities they're given, all while looking directly at me. When neighbors asked how school was going, she'd give them detailed updates about my latest poor performance, shaking her head sadly like I was some kind of lost cause. The sign incident happened during our annual summer barbecue. It was always this big event that my dad loved hosting. He'd invite everyone, his work colleagues, our neighbors, relatives from both sides of the family friends I'd known since I was little. It was usually one of my favorite days of the year because I got to see people I cared about, and everyone was relaxed and happy. That year, I'd just gotten my final grades for junior year. They weren't great, mostly CS with a couple of DS in subjects I really struggled with. But they weren't catastrophic either, and I knew I could bring them up senior year. My dad had looked at the report card and just sighed, asking me to try harder next year. I thought that was the end of it. But my stepmother had different plans. The morning of the barbecue, she called me into the kitchen where she was preparing food. She had this piece of cardboard in her hands and she'd written on it in thick black marker. The words are burned into my memory: "I am a failure and disgrace my family." She told me that since I clearly didn't care about my education or my family's reputation, I needed to own up to my choices publicly. She said that maybe if I experienced real consequences and real shame, I'd finally be motivated to change. She hung the sign around my neck with kitchen twine and told me I had to wear it for the entire barbecue. I was mortified. I begged her to reconsider, promising I'd do better next year, promising I'd get tutoring, promising anything if she'd just let me take off the sign. But she was unmovable. She said this was a natural consequence of my actions and that she was doing it because she cared about my future. The guests started arriving around noon and I had to stand there greeting everyone with that sign around my neck. The reactions were worse than I could have imagined. Some people looked genuinely shocked and uncomfortable. Others seemed to think it was funny, making jokes about modern parenting techniques. A few people took photos, saying they wanted to show their own kids what happens when you don't take school seriously. My dad's sister pulled him aside at one point and I could see them having what looked like a heated conversation near the fence. But nothing came of it. My dad just looked at me with this expression I couldn't read, part embarrassment, part something else I couldn't identify. The absolute worst moment came when my dad's boss arrived with his wife and teenage daughter. The daughter was someone I'd met before at various events and we'd always gotten along well. She was smart, involved in lots of activities, clearly headed for a good college. When she saw me with the sign, her face went through this progression of confusion, then understanding, then what looked like pity. She didn't say anything mean, but the way she looked at me made me feel smaller than I'd ever felt in my life. Throughout the afternoon, I kept hoping my stepmother would decide I'd learned my lesson and let me take the sign off. But she seemed energized by the attention it was getting. She kept making comments to the other adults about how important it was to hold children accountable, how too many parents were afraid to actually parent their kids these days. By the time the last guests left that evening, I felt completely hollowed out. I'd spent 6 hours being publicly humiliated in front of people whose opinions mattered to me. I'd watched adults I respected either laugh at my situation or look at me with pity. I'd seen kids my own age witness my shame and know that I'd be remembered for this moment. That night, I lay in bed replaying every interaction, every look, every comment. I felt angry at my stepmother, obviously, but I also felt angry at my dad for not stopping it. I felt angry at myself for not being brave enough to just take the sign off and face whatever consequences came next. Most of all, I felt this deep sense of betrayal. The people who were supposed to protect me and support me had instead chosen to humiliate me in the most public way possible. The aftermath was almost as bad as the event itself. Word spread quickly through our community about what had happened. Some people thought my stepmother had been brilliant, sharing the story as an example of effective parenting. Others were clearly disturbed by it, though most of them never said anything directly to me. At school that fall, I found out that photos from the barbecue had made their way onto social media. Some of my classmates had seen them and were passing them around. I became known as the girl whose parents made her wear the shame sign. Teachers who had heard about it would sometimes give me these looks that made me feel like they were seeing me differently, like they were trying to figure out if I really was as much of a failure as my stepmother had proclaimed. The whole experience changed how I saw myself and my place in my family. I started spending more time away from home, staying late at school or at friends' houses. I became more withdrawn, more careful about what I shared with my dad and stepmother. I felt like I couldn't trust them with my vulnerabilities anymore because they might be used against me in ways I couldn't predict. My senior year grades actually did improve, but not because of the motivation my stepmother thought the humiliation would provide. Instead, I became focused on getting good enough grades to earn scholarships and get into college far away from home. I wanted to prove that I wasn't the failure she'd labeled me as, but more importantly, I wanted to escape to a place where that label couldn't follow me. The college application process became my obsession. I spent hours researching schools, writing essays, applying for every scholarship I could find. I didn't want to depend on my family financially any more than absolutely necessary. I wanted to be able to leave and stay gone if I chose to. When I got accepted to a state school 3 hours away with enough financial aid to cover most of my expenses, I felt like I'd won some kind of victory. But it was a hollow victory because it meant acknowledging that I needed to put distance between myself and my family in order to feel safe and valued. Update 1. I posted this story a few weeks ago and got a lot of responses, so I thought I'd share what's been happening since then. Reading everyone's comments really helped me process some things I hadn't fully understood about that situation and my family dynamics in general. A lot of people asked about my dad's role in all this, and honestly, that's something I've been thinking about a lot lately. For years, I focused most of my anger on my stepmother because she was the one who actually made me wear the sign. But the more I think about it, the more I realize that my dad's failure to protect me was just as damaging, maybe even more so because I expected better from him. I decided to call him last week. We don't talk super regularly, maybe once a month or so since I graduated college. Usually our conversations are pretty surface level, just checking in about work and life stuff. But this time I brought up the barbecue incident directly. His reaction was not what I expected. He got really quiet for a long time, and then he said he'd always regretted not stopping it. He said he knew it was wrong even while it was happening, but he didn't know how to handle the situation without causing a huge fight in front of all our guests. He said my stepmother had convinced him that tough love was what I needed, and that he'd been worried about undermining her authority as a parent. I told him how much that day had affected me, how it changed the way I saw our family and my place in it. I explained that I'd spent years feeling like I couldn't trust either of them with my problems or vulnerabilities. I think he was genuinely surprised by how deep the impact had been. The conversation was hard, but it felt important. He apologized, which was something I hadn't expected. He said he wished he'd been braver that day, that he'd put my well-being ahead of keeping peace in his marriage. He also told me some things about my stepmother that I hadn't known before. Apparently, she'd grown up in a really strict household where public shame was used as a regular punishment. Her parents would make her stand in front of their church congregation and apologize for various misbehaviors. She told my dad that these experiences had taught her important lessons about accountability and had made her a stronger person. She genuinely believed that what she was doing to me was helpful, not harmful. That doesn't excuse what she did, but it helped me understand her mindset a little better. It also made me realize that she probably never saw me as an individual with my own feelings and needs. To her, I was a problem to be solved, a behavior to be corrected. My dad also admitted that their marriage had been struggling for a while and that he'd been afraid that disagreeing with her parenting approach would make things worse between them. He said he'd been trying to hold the family together but that he'd failed to protect me in the process. After we hung up, I felt this weird mix of relief and sadness. Relief because finally having an honest conversation about what had happened felt like lifting a weight I'd been carrying for years. Sadness because I realized how much damage had been done to our relationship and how much time we'd lost being distant from each other. I've been thinking about reaching out to some of the people who were at that barbecue, particularly my dad's sister, who I saw arguing with him that day. I'm curious about what other people were thinking and feeling while it was happening. Part of me wonders if more people were uncomfortable with the situation than I realized at the time. I'm also considering whether I want to have a direct conversation with my stepmother at some point. I'm not sure what I'd hoped to accomplish, but there's a part of me that wants her to understand how her actions affected me. I don't know if she's capable of that kind of self-reflection, but maybe it would be worth trying. The whole experience has made me think a lot about family dynamics and how children get caught in the middle of adult problems. I'm grateful that I was able to get away for college and build some independence, but I also feel sad for my younger self who didn't have anyone advocating for her when she needed it most. Update 2. So much has happened since my last update that I barely know where to start. I did end up reaching out to my dad's sister, and that conversation opened up a whole can of worms that I wasn't expecting. She was incredibly relieved to hear from me. Apparently, she's been carrying guilt about that day for years. She told me that she'd been horrified when she saw me with the sign and that she'd immediately confronted my dad about it. She said she'd told him that what was happening was abusive and that he needed to stop it immediately. But here's the part that really shocked me. She said my dad had told her that I'd agreed to wear the sign as part of a deal to avoid getting grounded for the entire summer. She said he'd made it sound like it was my choice, like I preferred the public embarrassment to missing out on summer activities with my friends. When she told me this, I felt like the ground was shifting under my feet. I've spent years thinking that my dad was just weak and conflict avoidant, but this suggested something much more deliberate. He'd apparently lied to his own sister to cover up what was really happening. I called him back and confronted him about this directly. At first, he denied it, saying his sister must have misunderstood. But when I pressed him, he finally admitted that he'd made up the story about me agreeing to it. He said he'd been embarrassed about the whole situation and had wanted to make it sound less bad than it was. This revelation changed everything for me. It meant that not only had he failed to protect me, but he'd also actively covered up the abuse afterward. He'd let people believe that I'd chosen to be humiliated, rather than admitting that his wife had forced it on me. The conversation got pretty heated. I told him that lying about what happened was almost as bad as letting it happen in the first place. I said that by making people think I'd agreed to it, he'd made me look like I was seeking attention or trying to be dramatic. He'd stolen my ability to have people understand what had really happened to me. He kept apologizing and saying he'd been trying to protect the family's reputation, but I pointed out that he'd been protecting his and my stepmother's reputations at the expense of mine. He'd thrown me under the bus to make himself look better. After that phone call, I decided I needed to talk to my stepmother directly. I'd been avoiding it for years, but I realized that I needed to hear her perspective and tell her mine. I drove down to their house on a Saturday morning when I knew she'd be home. The conversation was surreal. She seemed genuinely confused about why I was bringing up something that had happened so long ago. When I explained how much the experience had affected me, she kept saying things like, "But it worked, didn't it? Your grades improved after that." I tried to explain that my grades had improved because I'd become desperate to escape, not because I'd learned some valuable lesson about accountability. I told her about the social media photos, about being known at school as the girl with the shame sign, about how the experience had damaged my relationship with my dad. Her response was to say that maybe I was being too sensitive, that what didn't kill me had made me stronger. She said that her own parents had used similar methods and that she'd turned out fine. She seemed incapable of understanding that what had felt empowering to her had felt devastating to me. But then something unexpected happened. My dad came home while we were talking, and when he realized what we were discussing, he actually stood up to her in a way I'd never seen before. He told her that what she'd done was wrong, that it had damaged our family, and that he should have stopped it at the time. They started arguing, and I realized I was watching years of buried resentment come to the surface. My dad was finally saying things he should have said 5 years ago, and my stepmother was getting defensive in a way that made it clear she'd never really examined her own actions. I ended up leaving while they were still fighting. I felt emotionally drained, but also strangely relieved. For the first time, I'd seen my dad actually defend me and take responsibility for his role in what had happened. He called me later that evening to apologize again and to tell me that he and my stepmother were going to start having some serious conversations about their marriage and their approach to conflict. He said that talking to me had made him realize how much damage had been done, not just to me but to all of our relationships with each other. I don't know what's going to happen with their marriage, and honestly, I'm not sure I care anymore. What matters to me is that I finally feel like I've been heard and understood. The truth about what happened is finally out in the open, and the people who hurt me are having to face the reality of their actions. Final update. It's been about 6 months since my last update, and I wanted to share how everything has resolved. The whole situation with my family has changed dramatically, and I think I finally have some closure on this chapter of my life. My dad and stepmother ended up separating about 2 months after our confrontation. He moved into his own apartment across town, and they started the divorce process. He called to tell me about it, and while I felt bad that their marriage was ending, I also felt relieved that he was finally prioritizing his own well-being and his relationship with me. The divorce has been pretty amicable, all things considered. My stepmother kept the house, and my dad found a small place that he really seems to like. He's been going to individual counseling to work through some of his conflict avoidance issues, and he says it's helping him understand why he made the choices he did. We've been talking more regularly, and our conversations have gotten much deeper and more honest. He's told me more about what his marriage was like, how he'd gradually lost touch with his own instincts about what was right and wrong. He said that confronting him about the barbecue incident was a wake-up call that helped him realize how far he'd drifted from the person he wanted to be. I've also been working on processing all of this stuff on my own. I started journaling regularly, which has helped me sort through my feelings about everything that happened. I've also been more open with my close friends about my family's situation, and their support has been incredible. One of the most healing things that happened was completely unexpected. I ran into my dad's boss's daughter at a coffee shop near my apartment. She's the one who was at the barbecue that day, and I'd always wondered what she thought about the whole situation. She recognized me and came over to say hi, and somehow we ended up talking about that day. She told me that she'd been really disturbed by what she'd seen, and that she'd actually talked to her own parents about it afterward. She said her mom had wanted to call child services, but her dad had talked her out of it because he worked with my dad and didn't want to create workplace drama. She also told me that she'd never forgotten about it, and that it had actually influenced how she thought about parenting and family dynamics. She said seeing me in that situation had made her more aware of how adults can abuse their power over children, even when they think they're doing the right thing. Hearing this was incredibly validating. For years, I'd wondered if I was overreacting, if maybe this situation hadn't been as bad as I remembered. But having someone else confirm that it had been genuinely disturbing and inappropriate helped me trust my own perceptions. She also mentioned that she'd seen some of the photos from that day on social media back in high school, and that she'd actually reported them and gotten them taken down. I'd never known that someone had done that for me, and it meant more than I can express. As for my stepmother, I haven't had any contact with her since that day at their house. My dad has told me that she's been struggling with the divorce and has been saying that everyone is overreacting to what happened. He said she still doesn't seem to understand why her actions were harmful, and that she feels like she's being punished for trying to be a good parent. I feel sad for her in some ways because I think she genuinely believed she was helping me. But I also feel grateful that I don't have to deal with her anymore. I don't have to worry about her judgment or her unpredictable reactions to my choices. My relationship with my dad isn't perfect, and I don't think it ever will be. Too much damage was done during those years when he failed to protect me. But it's gotten so much better, and I feel like I have my dad back in a way I hadn't realized I'd lost him. He's been making a real effort to understand how his actions affected me, and he's been consistent about taking responsibility without making excuses. He's also been respecting my boundaries and not pressuring me to forgive and forget everything that happened. Last month, he asked if I'd be willing to come to one of his counseling sessions with him. His counselor had suggested that it might be helpful for us to have a facilitated conversation about our relationship and how we want to move forward. I was nervous about it, but it ended up being really productive. We were able to talk through some of the lingering hurt and resentment I'd been carrying, and he was able to explain some of his thought processes during that time period without making them sound like excuses. The counselor helped us both understand how the power dynamics in our family had gotten so messed up, and how we could build a healthier relationship going forward. We've agreed to do a few more sessions together over the next few months. Looking back on everything that's happened, I'm grateful that I finally decided to confront the situation head-on. For years, I'd been carrying around this pain and anger without really dealing with it. I'd been letting it affect my relationships and my self-perception without even realizing it. Speaking up about what happened to me was scary, but it was also incredibly empowering. It helped me reclaim my own story and refuse to let other people's versions of events define my experience. It also helped me rebuild a relationship with my dad that I thought was permanently damaged. I still think about that day at the barbecue sometimes, but it doesn't have the same power over me that it used to. Instead of feeling ashamed and small when I remember it, I feel proud of myself for surviving it and for eventually finding the courage to speak up about it. I've learned that healing doesn't always look like forgiveness or reconciliation. Sometimes it looks like setting boundaries, demanding honesty, and refusing to accept treatment that doesn't align with your worth. Sometimes it looks like walking away from relationships that aren't serving you, even when those relationships are with family members. But in my case, healing has also looked like giving people the opportunity to do better, and being willing to rebuild trust when they show consistent change. My dad has proven that he's committed to being a better parent and a better person, and I'm glad I gave him that chance. I'm 23 now, and I feel like I'm finally starting to understand who I am outside of that family dynamic. I'm building relationships based on mutual respect and genuine care. I'm pursuing goals that matter to me, not trying to prove my worth to people who should have valued me unconditionally from the beginning. That 17-year-old girl who stood in her backyard wearing a sign about her failures deserved so much better than what she got. But the 23-year-old woman writing this has learned to advocate for herself, to trust her own perceptions, and to build a life that reflects her actual worth rather than other people's judgments. If you're dealing with something similar, I want you to know that your feelings are valid, that you deserve to be treated with respect and kindness, and that it's never too late to speak up for yourself. It might be scary, and it might change your relationships in ways you don't expect, but living your truth is always worth it in the end.